Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. Well, I am so excited today because I'm bringing you an interview with Jahred Liddie. He is a PhD candidate at the Department of Environmental Health in the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health at Harvard University. And he focuses on environmental justice issues related to PFAS contamination. It was a great conversation, an amazing interview, and it came at the right time because PFAS is all over the news. There is so much happening with PFAS. If you've been reading, if you've been paying attention, you know that the EPA has proposed regulations for PFAS. They have not passed yet, but they are in the proposal phase. And you will also know that the big company 3M, they make Post-it notes, they make all kinds of stuff. They just settled a $10 billion lawsuit because of PFAS contamination that they've facilitated throughout the country. And so there's just a lot going on around PFAS, and I think it's good to have this interview now because instead of just thinking about PFAS in an abstract way, we're able to think about it as an environmental justice issue. The person I'm speaking with in this interview, Jahred, he has found that Black communities and Hispanic communities are disproportionately impacted by PFAS contamination. And so when these regulations pass, when these settlements get distributed, we need to recognize that there's a disproportionate impact that Black and Brown communities face when it comes to PFAS contamination. And I hope that there's a disproportionate amount of input and resources sent to those communities to help them deal with these issues, because it's very important to recognize it's not a blanket issue across the country. It is very much an environmental justice concern. And so coming up next, we have my interview with Jahred Liddie talking about PFAS contamination and environmental justice. I hope you enjoy it. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. And today we have a very, very, very special guest with us. His name is Jahred Liddie. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health at Harvard University. Jahred, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I appreciate you being here. And we're talking to you because you put out this amazing nationwide study on PFAS, and you're looking at PFAS from the vantage point of environmental justice. And so I want to talk to you about your study, talk to you about even why you want to do it, what you found while you were doing it, and just really pick your brain as to how we should be thinking about these kind of issues, particularly when you're thinking about water contamination, emerging contamination, all these different kinds of issues that I think need more and more research and more work done. And so your study is phenomenal. I'm so glad you're able to talk to us. But before we get started, can you just tell us about yourself, where you're from, your background, maybe upbringing? How'd you get to Harvard? How'd you get to study public health? All those fun things.
Yeah, I'd definitely be happy to. So I grew up in New Jersey, in central New Jersey, so kind of on the border between Howell and Freehold, New Jersey. I was always interested in the natural world as a kid and always had a pretty deep interest in environmental issues as well. Because of that, I always really enjoyed, my science classes, and throughout middle school, throughout high school, I was always really into chemistry and physics and some of the math classes I took. And so after I, left high school, after I left New Jersey, I went to college at Harvard College. I studied environmental engineering, and I also studied environmental policy in college. So I got to, from an academic kind of standpoint, delve more into some of those issues and some of those environmental issues specifically. I later worked as a research assistant in my undergrad in actually my current advisor's lab, and we did some research on PFAS, and that was actually where I learned about what PFAS are, and also really learned more about the kind of the intersection between engineering, the classes I was taking then, and public health, and particularly environmental health as well. So that really planted that seed in my brain about bridging these two topics together. As kind of some backdrop, important backdrop of what was happening at the time. So the Flint, Michigan water crisis was actually kind of at the same time as I was in undergrad. Seeing that event happening and, seeing how issues like structural racism can cause, disparities in environmental health and outcomes for individuals in real time really also was kind of underpinning some of my academic training as well. And that also informed some of my interests in environmental health. And so after I graduated from undergrad, I worked as a sustainability consultant for a few years, primarily doing life cycle assessments where we're kind of trying to understand the environmental footprint of different kinds of products. And that was interesting for a few years. I eventually grew a little bit tired and actually wanted to do some more like public health relevant kinds of work. So I left and I went back to grad school and did my master's degree in environmental health at the Harvard Chan School. And so then I really kind of delved into, environmental health, public health, did classes in epidemiology and biostatistics and all sorts of fields to give me some more public health training. And so I started my master's actually a few months before the pandemic began. So that was another kind of, current event in the world that really shaped a lot of my research interests, a lot of my academic kinds of training as well. And after I graduated from my master's degree, I then started my PhD in the same department at the same school. So now, kind of working on my research, it's all focused on PFAS and drinking water. I'm definitely will talk more about that throughout the podcast, but that's how I arrived here today.
Okay, very cool. And so I'm particularly excited because your environmental engineering background led you to look at issues of public health, to look at environmental justice. And so I'm excited to see that engineering background is kind of what underpins the way that you engage these issues and these topics and these conversations. And so for all the engineers listening, you don't have to just graduate and be a consultant. There are other ways that you can make a difference and make an impact. And we have an example right here where Jahred went from environmental engineering to public health to look at environmental justice issues. And so I'm just excited to know that that trajectory is part of your story. And then when I think about the Flint, Michigan crisis, I know it made an imprint on a lot of our minds. And those of us who've kind of been in this environmental justice world, we might have just read about it, seen some smaller kind of instances in our communities, but to see that incident on a big national stage making worldwide news, I mean, I know for me it made a big impact on how I viewed environmental justice and particularly water, because that's one of my passions is dealing with water issues and water contamination. From your vantage point, I'm not sure if you were in school at the time or if you were working as a consultant at that point, but was that crisis something that kind of shifted your perspective and kind of moved you towards where you are now, or kind of were you already on that path and this is just another event that confirmed the need for you to go where you were going?
I was definitely aware of environmental justice issues before the Flint, Michigan crisis happened. I think it did shift me more into doing this kind of work because it was happening real time, and so I hadn't really witnessed an event like that in my lifetime, and so it did take it from being a set of issues that I was invested and interested in as an individual to being something that I wanted to work on, and I wanted to do my own research on as well. So that was definitely like a formative event in terms of what was happening in the world that informed my research as well.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely informed mine a lot. And I guess as a PhD candidate, how would you describe your research interests? Like, are they broad? Like, I'm thinking about things like environmental justice. We're talking about water. This is PFAS. You could talk about emerging contaminants. I know for me, when I was on my PhD, I focused on more broadly emerging contaminants, water treatment, environmental justice. Like, how would you describe your research interests?
Yeah. So my research interests are, right now all on PFAS, specifically in drinking water. I'm also focusing specifically on public water systems in the US. And so my research involves environmental justice issues, trying to understand disparities in PFAS contamination, as well trying to understand trends over time in PFAS contamination, particularly because there have been industrial shifts in production of PFAS over time. So we don't necessarily know as much about what that means for contamination. And then related to all that, I'm also interested in how we can think about this in terms of human health outcomes as well. So can we make some link between PFAS contamination, specifically of drinking water, and human health. So those are the kinds of issues I'm interested in specifically for PFAS in drinking water.
Okay, yeah. Can you tell us more about PFAS, what those are? I know it's been in the news, and obviously your study's been in the news, but generally speaking, I've seen a lot of traffic about PFAS, what it is, where we can find it, what it does to our health, how it impacts the environment. And so can you just give us some background just to help us understand what PFAS are? What are we even talking about?
Yeah, so PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. That's what the abbreviation stands for. They're a really large group of man-made chemical compounds, and they're all characterized by carbon-fluorine bonds. And so, if you remember from chemistry, that kind of bond is really strong. And for industrial applications, for consumer product applications, that gives them really useful properties. So they have both non-stick, hydrophobic, and hydrophilic, or like water resistant, water loving kinds of properties. And they're also really resistant to breakdown in the environment. What that means for human health and environmental health is that they don't break down easily. So PFAS are pretty persistent in the environment, also persistent in organisms, including humans. And we know from right now a few decades of animal and human health studies that even at low levels of exposure to PFAS, they can result in adverse health outcomes for individuals. And so that's why we're really concerned about them from a public health perspective.
Okay, perfect. And then I know just from what I've learned, just over time reading articles and different types of discussions, that PFAS appears to be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, appears to be very pervasive in the environment. Like it's everywhere. I hear it described as forever chemicals. And my understanding is that all of us, no matter who we are, where we are, at some point in time, we've probably been exposed to PFAS. We probably have some in our system. And it's funny, when I read the articles, I get the sense that we're kind of all affected by PFAS. And so I wonder, for your research and for this study in particular, how did you come to the realization that you want to look at PFAS from an environmental justice perspective? Because in my mind, environmental justice suggests that there's one group that's more disproportionately impacted than another. But when I think about PFAS, I get the sense that we're all impacted by it and we're all subject to being exposed to it. And so how did you come to this research question, this topic that you kind of focused in on for this study and I guess for your research in general?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, on one hand, we know from surveys, many of them done in the US, that, virtually everyone is exposed to PFAS and has measurable levels of PFAS like in their blood. And related to that as well, there's many different ways that an individual can get exposed to PFAS. So PFAS are in drinking water, as I'll discuss. There's exposure for some individuals by food, by dust exposure, by consumer products as well. So there's many different ways to be exposed as well. So for my specific study that we're going to talk about today, we focused on drinking water as an exposure source, specifically. And we crafted our idea for the study because we know from previous research and from historical accounts as well that sources of industrial pollution, hazardous waste facilities are disproportionately located near marginalized communities, including communities of color and lower income communities as well. And we know from chemistry that PFAS are man-made substances and in many cases can come from industrial origins. And so we had this idea that, and this hypothesis that because of these two factors, that PFAS in drinking water, we may actually see certain sociodemographic groups could be more highly exposed to PFAS by drinking water, because drinking water can be contaminated by some of those industrial sources. And that was our idea and our hypothesis going into this work.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're thinking about the sources, where those sources might be located and how those sources might disproportionately impact those communities that surround them versus all of us kind of equally being exposed to PFAS. And so when we talk about sources, I'm assuming you're talking about industry, facilities, things of that nature. And with this being an emerging contaminant, which I don't think is regulated at the moment, it had to be pretty difficult to get actual reliable data to do a study like this, because I can't imagine an industry providing you the data. I don't think there's people monitoring it because it's not federally or state requirements in place. Maybe there are. Definitely correct me. So I guess my question is, how did you do the study?
Yeah.
How did you actually get information that could be useful to make the findings that you had in your study?
Yep. So that was a real challenge. Yeah. So first, I want to say this study is a collaboration with Dr. Lowell Shader, who's at the Silent Spring Institute, and my advisor, Professor Elsie Sunderland. And so for our study, we have a bunch of different data sources that we're compiling together. And so in terms of the drinking water data that we're using, right now in the US, PFAS are not federally regulated in drinking water, although that could change even within the next year. And so more recently, we've had to rely on state monitoring for PFAS for public water systems. And that can come from a combination of some states that have their own regulations at a state level that are doing monitoring to understand whether public water systems are below those thresholds that they're setting, or other states that are doing monitoring to kind of understand if there is contamination in their state at all. And so our approach to doing the study was to combine a lot of that data together. So we specifically combined 18 different monitoring campaigns done around the US from different states to get our data set of community water systems. And community water systems are public water systems that just serve the same population year round. So you can think of the data that we're using as coming from, something similar to your utility if you're served by a utility. And alongside that, we combine all of this with census information to understand, what is the demographic profile of those community water systems in terms of the counties that they're serving. So that's all coming from the census. We combine that as well with these different databases that the EPA has made for researchers, for individuals to understand where community water systems are serving, and also has some other kinds of characteristics about them, like the population that they serve and how many people that they serve and what kind of source water that they use. And then we also incorporate data on the PFAS sources that we were talking about. And our paper, because there are actually also many, many sources of PFAS contamination, we focus on kind of a narrow list of ones that have been identified in the past as being associated with contamination. And so these include major industrial facilities that have produced PFAS in the past. These include military fire training areas that may have used firefighting foams or even currently use firefighting foams that contain high concentrations of PFAS, as well as airports that may have also used those firefighting foams. And we also use a list of wastewater treatment plants around the US and landfills. And both of these can think of maybe in some cases being, the end of life kind of place where PFAS may go. So either through disposal of consumer products or other kinds of products that contain PFAS. And so we rely on a list that was used previously from another study, but there's many other sources of PFAS as well. So our study isn't, looking at all of them, just a kind of a condensed list.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think I have your study with me. And so I think you had 18 states that you went through and studied. Let's get to the findings first. I think that's the really big headline that we want to really talk about and dig deep into. I saw your study on the GRIST. I've seen it on other websites as well. And the big headline is always the same. Black and Hispanic communities most likely to have drinking water with PFAS. And so you have your Black and Hispanic communities, environmental justice issue. You have PFAS, emerging contaminant, also a big issue. You have drinking water, which is always a concern because when we see different issues in our society, it usually revolves around drinking water, the quality, the availability. And so I feel like your study hit all of the big ticket issues all at once. And so that's, I think, why, and obviously it's very good research, but it's also something that people are really concerned about. And I think it's really resonating and people are starting to see more about it. What was it in your study or what did you find that led you to that conclusion where you could say that with confidence that Black and Hispanic communities are more likely to have PFAS in their drinking water? I wonder what you saw or what things that you identified that led you to that conclusion.
Yeah, so I'll kind of first talk about some of the three main kind of components that our paper has, and then I'll talk about how we got to that conclusion. So we took all these data and we had three primary research questions in mind. The first is actually not related to environmental justice or disparities, but is kind of going back to this earlier study that used nationwide data on PFAS around the US, more limited in terms of some of the laboratory methods, but was one of the first data sets out there on PFAS in drinking water in the US. And so we compared using the same methods as that prior study. We analyzed whether contamination sources, this group that I mentioned earlier, were associated with PFAS concentrations around the US. And then we actually compared directly with that study to see, do we see similar kinds of associations? Are there differences, and why there may be differences as well? Second, we analyzed this association between sociodemographic factors and contamination sources. And those are the same group of sources as the first research question. And we specifically focus on, for our main analysis, we focus on sociodemographic factors that relate to communities that experience segregation, that experience structural racism and poverty. And so that included the proportion of Hispanic residents, proportion of Black residents, and residents under the federal poverty line. Although we also actually have analyses that do other things with some other demographic factors as well. And so that is kind of getting to a citing question about, are certain communities, are their water systems more in proximity to sources of PFAS contamination than others? And do we see differences or not? And then the third, we take our drinking water data and we analyze whether the communities served by community water systems that have detectable levels of PFAS contamination, are they more likely or not to detect, PFAS? And so that's kind of directly with the drinking water data. And throughout that specific third analysis, we did simpler statistical tests where we're just kind of comparing the demographics for systems that do and don't exceed 5 nanograms per liter in terms of the concentrations of PFAS that they detect or didn't detect. And then we went all the way to more sophisticated, statistical modeling where we're adjusting for differences maybe between states in terms of demographics or contamination. And we consider different kinds of community water system characteristics like the source water, like whether they had potentially relevant technologies for treatment of PFAS, as well as, the system size. And then we actually also take into account sources of contamination as well, and the same sources that we analyzed earlier. So do we even see a difference, beyond taking into account differences in those contamination sources? Is there still kind of a residual association between those demographic factors and PFAS contamination? And for that third analysis, we saw these associations persisted throughout those analyses, where we saw that systems serving greater Hispanic and Black populations were more likely to detect PFAS. And so that's why we came to that conclusion, because it was consistent throughout all the analyses, consistent throughout a range of sensitivity analyses as well. And so that's ultimately why we came to that conclusion.
Interesting. So very detailed, very thorough. I guess I had one quick question. I forgot to ask this earlier, but I mentioned that you had 18 states in the study. You talked about getting data from each of the states and I guess compiling it to do your analysis. You're looking at that in relation to the communities that are surrounding these sources that might be potentially producing these contaminants to see how that relates to exposure. And so can you talk a little bit about what it was like to compile this data and to do the specific analysis that you did? Because I would imagine that there's not a national PFAS approach to collecting data and that these states probably do things differently. And then when it's time to look at the sources, how did you locate those sources? How did you compile that information and correlate the two? I would love to know more about that process of doing that kind of data collection and analysis.
Yeah. And it was not easy. So we sort of had several criteria that we were using to include or exclude data from states in order to kind of, harmonize the data across all these different sources and be able to have, a consistent kind of real data set to work with. And so that included things like ensuring that all of the laboratory methods for all of the data are similar. It's they're standard laboratory approaches actually drafted by the EPA. And so that was one of our criteria. So anything not using those methods, we didn't include in our analysis. We also specifically focused on states that had done like a statewide monitoring campaign. So there's other states that aren't included in our study that may have done sampling for a smaller group of systems, maybe just, a handful of systems that have decided to do some kind of PFAS monitoring. So we're really focusing on either states that did their own kind of monitoring campaign to understand contamination. So in many cases, that includes dozens or hundreds of systems, or systems that actually are required to do monitoring because their state has a regulation set for PFAS in drinking water. So that would normally require that they do monitoring of some kind. So criteria like these are kind of what enabled us to harmonize the data set across all of these different sources. It's a lot of coding. It's a lot of, kind of nitty gritty programming work to get everything together. But ultimately, after applying all those kind of criteria, we have a data set of systems that's around 8,000 community water systems included in our study, and they serve in total around 70 million people in the U.S.
Interesting. Very interesting. So the big find that made the news was that Black Hispanic communities are more likely to be exposed to PFAS. But as I was going through your study, another finding really jumped out to me. And I want to just read it to you and get your thoughts and kind of help me understand why it is this way for your study. It says that the results indicated that a 6 to 18% decrease in the odds of detecting PFAS above 5 nanograms per liter were observed for each percentage point higher proportion of residents under the federal poverty line served by community water system. Each percentage point higher under the poverty line was associated with 13.8%, 18% lower odds of detection above the state's level PFAS MCL. And so I read that, and what I understood was, for your study at least, the higher the poverty level in a particular area, the lower the exposure to PFAS, which was really interesting because in most instances, we assume that poverty is one of those factors that would lead to higher exposure to different contaminants. More issues related to environmental justice would be present in those kinds of communities. And even though we know that race is the primary factor for experiencing disproportionate impacts, class is usually close behind. But in this study, it seems like race is definitely one, and then actually poverty produces the opposite result. And so how would you explain that to someone like me who's going to automatically assume when I read the title that, it's going to be race, it's going to be poor people who are more exposed to PFAS? You're saying no. Actually, in this study, people who are in communities that see more poverty are less exposed to PFAS.
Yeah. So that, I think there are many reasons why we did find that, and we actually have another analysis that I'll talk about as well that complicates this picture a little bit too. So in our main analysis, yes, we did find that an increase in residents under the poverty line lowered likelihood that a system was detecting PFAS. And that was a counterintuitive result to us. And so we then tried to hypothesize some ways that, why would this be the case? So the first kind of reason, just thinking about, counties, thinking about demographics, thinking about the structure of the US, is that many of these PFAS sources we saw are in more urban areas, where actually at a county level, the poverty rate is lower than many rural areas of the US. So in some ways, you can see this inverse association, this negative association between these two variables as indicative of kind of the urban signature of PFAS, and also isolation, economic isolation of some of these rural areas from industry. Some industry being industry that are contaminated with PFAS or contaminate the environment with PFAS. So that's kind of our main hypothesis as to why we see this association. The second association, or the second reason, is that when you think about environmental justice studies as a whole, one kind of issue that they deal with is kind of the unit of analysis that they analyze. So for our demographic data, we're using county level data because that is right now the most available that you can link with water systems around the US. It gets a little bit more complicated, for example, if you were using finer grain kinds of spatial unit for the analysis. So if we instead looked at, cities or census blocks or census tracts, you may see something a little bit different, especially in some of the urban areas of the U.S. where, at a county scale, we can see poverty is lower than in rural areas. But if you dug in a little bit more, you could actually see a lot of variation in terms of income across census blocks or census tracts, even in the same city. And so in some ways that may be washed out at a county scale when you're doing an analysis like ours. And so with that first hypothesis, we actually then, as I was mentioning, we did another analysis to understand this a little bit better. And so we took some other information on the percent of residents in the area that live in a more rural area versus more urban areas around the US. And so we then split our data by areas that are more rural versus areas that are more urban. And then we redid our analysis where we're looking at demographic factors and PFAS contamination of water systems. And in that analysis, we actually found that in more of the rural areas, PFAS contamination is actually positively associated with residents under the federal poverty line, although in urban areas, that negative association is still shown. So that was also confusing for us that, you see these opposite relationships in these areas. And so we kind of think this may reflect some of the differences in poverty between more urban and rural counties, that in some of these more rural areas, poverty may actually be a more important factor to consider when you're thinking about environmental justice for PFAS contamination. Although in more urban areas of the US, it seems negatively associated. And you see race and ethnicity being one of the important factors. So it's kind of a complicated picture, although that's kind of the trajectory of our study in terms of that specific finding.
Wow, that's interesting. So there's definitely, at least in this study, and I would imagine in others, differences that we can see when we think about rural populations, rural communities versus urban ones. And then even thinking about the residents in those communities, racially, ethnically would be different as well. And so it sounds like we really do need to think about all those different layers as we engage this kind of research. We can't just be too broad when we talk about how these issues are affecting one population over another. It pays to get granular. So I learned that. Would you say, when you think about more broadly PFAS, you think about water contamination, do you think that these types of patterns, these types of findings would be consistent with other types of contaminants? I'm thinking in my mind, thinking about things like lead. I'm thinking about arsenic is something I read a lot about. Radiological contamination, like radon, uranium. I know that in different parts of the country, these contaminants are issues. I wonder if we would see these same kind of disparities associated with those contaminants like we've seen with PFAS.
Yeah, that is another great question. So there are, I think, two ways to approach it. So the first that other researchers have talked about in the past is that when you're thinking about these connections between disparities, environmental justice disparities and drinking water quality, it's that different drinking water contaminants have different origins in terms of how they end up in our water. So some contaminants come from the natural environment, or even in some cases, natural environment plus human sources. And then others come from, human sources alone. And so PFAS are more in that group. And so whenever you're thinking about the mechanism that a particular contaminant, how it arises in the water and how that is disparate for different groups, you have to think about, is this mechanism that's driving this relationship, is that, different between demographic groups or not? And so that matters when you're thinking about more contaminants of natural origin versus man-made contaminants. Although even with that said, you do see differences and you do see disparities in contamination for a whole range of drinking water contaminants. So, as you mentioned, lead being one of kind of the case study examples. Arsenic, there's studies on arsenic differences in drinking water quality between demographic groups. We also have studies on nitrate. My co-author, Laurel Shader, has a paper on nitrate specifically where she found similar associations specifically for Hispanic communities. That's our study. And then you also see this for things like uranium, as you mentioned, and several other heavy metals, chromium, barium, all sorts of compounds. And even more broadly, there's studies also just looking at violations of drinking water quality standards, where they found communities serving more people of color were more likely to violate those regulations. So, even though there are a host of built environment differences, natural environment differences, community level differences, you do see throughout several contaminants, at least, that there are disparities that have been found in prior literature.
Interesting. That's interesting. I don't want to take up your whole afternoon. And so I want to keep pushing just because I want to get to how your findings should inform the way we move forward. And so thinking about some of the implications of what you've learned from your research and what you understand about these issues, you had an interesting statement in your study I want to read. It says the results of this work suggest that addressing environmental justice concerns should be a component of risk mitigation planning for areas affected by drinking water PFAS contamination. And so I guess my final question would be, what does that look like? What are you thinking and what are you seeing when you suggest that we should incorporate environmental justice concerns when we deal with PFAS contamination, or maybe even any contamination at all? What would that actually look like on the ground or in the community that you're thinking about?
So I guess I'll talk about, specifically for PFAS. One of the things that our paper, in some ways coming at a good time because there are some proposed regulations for PFAS in drinking water. Actually, a few PFAS in drinking water that the EPA is currently working on, and there's some expectation that that'll be finalized by the end of the year. So our paper is coming at a good time because of that. And actually, the levels that they're proposing are actually pretty similar to the ones that we analyze in our paper as well. And so alongside this, Biden administration has recently made environmental justice like one of their focuses for the EPA in terms of the regulations that they're going to set in the kind of the programs that they're looking to fund. And so one option that they've highlighted so far for PFAS is actually contained in the infrastructure bill, which is set to address some of these contamination concerns for PFAS. And so we think, based on our study, that if there is some kind of funding allocation that's going to be done in the next few years, that should keep disparities in mind in order, broadly speaking, not to perpetuate disparities, going into the future, and the ones that we've highlighted in this paper specifically. And so our study would suggest, they shouldn't just think about socioeconomic status. They shouldn't just think about race and ethnicity. They should think about both things together in order to address these environmental justice concerns. And so actually, several organizations have incorporated details from our study in public comments that they've made on these proposed regulations. They've said things like that the infrastructure bill should be, and ways to apply for grants should be easily accessible to water systems. Whether that's in providing things in different languages for community members to understand, or approaching community water systems specifically to think about applying for grants, and also to let the public know that these things are coming down the pipeline. And so I think the bottom line, when you think about environmental justice and you think about drinking water quality, and specifically PFAS that are coming from these man-made sources, is that you want communities to be equitably protected from contamination. And because of that, you also should keep in mind, kind of keep top of mind, that those who are disproportionately suffering from PFAS contamination shouldn't bear the brunt of cleaning it up either. So whether that is through some of this grant allocation that is targeted towards environmental justice communities, or whether that is offering methods for remediation of contamination at the source, or treatment in a water system, that it is meant to alleviate some of these disparities. And so that's kind of my thoughts right now on this kind of topic.
Nice. So communication, funding, awareness, being able to target the efforts to the communities that are experiencing this in a disproportionate way, I think is the way forward. And you're right. I know the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the new Office of Environmental Justice, they're all kind of tuned in and dialed into specifically confronting these types of issues. And so I think your study is timely in that way too, because it puts this on their radar in terms of understanding what the issues actually are and what needs to be confronted and addressed. If they approve this regulation, then it's going to be important to know that there are environmental justice concerns associated with this kind of contamination, so they can actually have that targeted approach to addressing it. So I think it's great. So what's next? What's coming on after this? So we know, because of your study, that PFAS is out there. It's a problem. We know that Black and brown communities are disproportionately impacted by it. We know that you have suggestions in your study about how it could be confronted and addressed in an equitable way. I mean, for me, I'll be done. Thank you, and get my degree. But obviously you're working on some more things, because you're always making sure that you advance our understanding of these issues. So what's the next thing that we can see coming from you, coming from your lab, from your research group in this area?
Yeah, actually, one thing I'll add to the previous question as well, and that's relevant for some of my work that I'm planning to do, is that, one of the nice things about our paper as well, I think, is that, previously a lot of the state data on PFAS monitoring was not available publicly for individuals and researchers to use or look at. And so along with the data, which is open access, and our study is open access as well, we want other researchers to be able to use some of these data for their projects. And so for me personally, going forward, so I am still deep in my, dissertation phase. I am looking to use some of these data to, see, do we, along with some of these shifts in production over time, so we kind of shifted from some PFAS that are actually called legacy PFAS into replacement compounds. I'm interested in seeing, do we see shifts in the contamination over time as well? So that's another project that I'm working on over the summer and throughout the next few years on community water systems again. Also really interested in leveraging some of these data to investigate health outcomes. So moving, just from the exposure side, where we're analyzing disparities, where we're seeing trends over time, into how do we then connect this with public health and health outcomes for individuals and communities. So that's what I'm planning to do for the rest of my dissertation research. For other individuals in our group. So we're doing research on, related to this environmental justice question, research on disparities in heavy metal contamination in drinking water as well. So that's another research project that several individuals in the lab group that I'm in are working on. And we're also interested in other sorts of environmental justice questions. So moving even just from drinking water into contamination from mercury around the US. So we've actually recently released a paper on that as well. And thinking even about, treatment technologies and disparities in use of these different kinds of treatment technologies that are in some cases relevant for treating PFAS. So we have a whole range of projects. I'm excited, for the next few years to see what kinds of research that we're able to do as well.
Oh, that's exciting. That's exciting. So, and I know it's going to go well. You're going to knock it out the park like you did with this one. All I ask is that when you publish again, when you get that research out, make sure if you get a chance, give us a call. We'd love to talk more about whatever else you learn. Continue to educate us on these issues and continue to show us the connections between these issues and environmental justice, because that's what this podcast is all about. We would love to continue to highlight the great work that you're doing, your research group. This study is amazing. I know your work is amazing. It's going to continue to be amazing. And so I just want to thank you for taking the time to tell us more about your study, to help us understand this issue better, and to continue to highlight why it's important for us to know these things. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Joseph.
Thank you. And that is our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.